Now, let's stay with this conversation. Can the government afford the increased wages of 10% that the Public Servants Association is asking for? We're joined by Azar Jameen from Econometrics. Thank you so much for your time. Doctor, we do appreciate it. I think the big question here is, the PSA has given government 7 days to respond to its 10% wage increase demand. Government is possibly not in a position to afford that 10%. Your view on this?
Government in the very short term probably can afford to give that, give assent to such a big increase, because there has been an overrun in government revenue due to the very high prices of coal, and coal mining companies have been making huge profits and therefore paying a lot of tax. However, coal prices have started coming down, and so the government knows that this bonanza that it's got right now is not going to last. There's a very good chance that the world economy goes into recession over the coming year in the face of rising interest rates, and if it goes into recession, commodity prices are likely to do poorly, and the South African economy will suffer, let alone suffering on account of load shedding and all that, and higher interest rates and all that. So in that sense, the government knows that if it were to succumb to the union demands right now, it would land up in a lot of trouble next year. The other thing to bear in mind is, once you give 10% now, that becomes your new base from which further increases have to be given next year and the year thereafter. Already South Africa has suffered a whole series of downgrades in our credit ratings, which have pushed up our long-term interest rates to around currently 11.5%. That is the interest that government is having to pay on borrowing money. If it now has to rely on borrowing still more money to sustain public sector remuneration at the elevated levels of, especially with a 10%, you mentioned 10, not even 6.5, then, in next to no time, we're going to be paying tens, probably 50 billion rand more per year on servicing debt, on paying interest on government debt. And that money then has to be removed from healthcare, education, all the other areas of government spending.
You touch on an important point about government needing to service its debts, and that could be pushed up to about 15 billion. And that's a lot of money if you look at what's actually going on. But I want to bring in the perspective of workers. And, the PSA had their picket 2 days ago where they expressed their dissatisfaction and disappointment in government, especially in the finance minister. And they've indicated that they have not received an increase in the past 3 years, and that 3% is a slap in the face. Is there any way that government could have possibly offered a little bit more than just that 3%?
Even the 3% goes above what government had originally budgeted. We're talking about negotiations and reaching compromises. I think this was the compromise that government thought it could just provide a little bit of flexibility. Your previous trade unionist from SATU was mentioning how they moved from 0 to 0.9 to 1.5 up to 3. So there was movement in that regard. So much and no more at a certain point in time. And also public servants need to realize that they are in a very fortunate situation. They've got employment. They are not about to be laid off. And that contrasts a lot with people in the private sector who are only too happy to have a job and who would take, in many cases, any kind of salary just to have a job. So public servants are in a privileged situation in many respects. They are not accountable to company profits, profitability, and whether the government's going to remain in place all the time. So the risks are relatively low. And usually when risks are low, the price of something is also relatively high, and the price that they're paying is maybe not to have such magnanimous pay increases as a few others might in industries which are doing well.
I want to ask you, Dr. Zah, about the threat from the Public Servants Association that should government not respond and meet their demands in 7 days after handing over that memorandum, there's going to be a national shutdown. And already our economy is on its knees, given what has happened over the last couple of years, load shedding and a number of other issues. Surely this is not going to be a good way forward should the PSA be able to bring in its numbers and go forward with this national shutdown.
You're absolutely correct, Heidi, that it won't be a pretty picture, but it would be even more detrimental if government were seen to be giving in to the unions. In next to no time, the rand would fall, our interest rates would have to rise a lot more still than would be the case without that. And in next to no time, a lot of people would be suffering a lot more than the few public servants who are complaining about getting 3% instead of 6.5% pay increase. Markets are watching this very closely, and it's almost a litmus test of government's ability to actually maintain its rectitude on an even path. If that image were to be shattered by government giving way to public servants, all mayhem will break out on financial markets. And unfortunately, we live in a globalized world where we are not isolated on our own from what the markets do. At the end of the day, the price to pay is a lot more interest on whatever government borrows, and that comes at the expense of service delivery in other far more vital areas.
You speak about the image being shattered, and I think the image has already been shattered, and there's just one little small section left of our image that's still intact, and government, of course, has that huge responsibility to make sure that that remains intact. Dr. Zah, I just want to ask you one last question. Workers had indicated their dissatisfaction with government's approach to corruption and looting of money, and they feel as though that if government had a grip on the big crisis of corruption and looting, there would be money available to pay this massive public wage bill. But is that really the case? Is there this endless pot of money that government can just dip into, even if we didn't have this massive crisis of corruption and looting? Is it, let me phrase it this way, is what workers are asking for out of the ordinary, or is there some kind of validation for what they're asking for? They're either 6.5% or they're 10%.
Look, they're absolutely correct. If we had not had a decade-long state capture, and if corruption weren't continuing even to the present, there would be more money available. For one thing, the economy would be growing faster, and government revenues, government would be collecting more taxes as a consequence. It's not entirely surprising that public servants are asking for more. Inflation has soared far more than has been the case for many, many years. And so people are finding that their disposable income is being eroded in this current situation. So it's not they are not being unreasonable. But at the same time, government is also in a tight situation, assuming, forgetting about the corruption side, government is finding it impossible to cope with corruption. Well, that is a fact of life. Then the unions have been supporting the government. They've been in alliance with the government. Why have they not been able to persuade the government to do something about it? And it's in that sense that it's a very ironical demand that they are making, that, if it weren't for you being corrupt, we would be getting higher pay increases. They're quite correct in that. But they are also in coalition with the government. So, you would have thought that they would have had an influence on that corruption themselves.
Certainly. It's just a wait and see, I suppose. Let's see what happens. But thank you so much for your insights. We always do appreciate your commentary. That was Dr. Zah Jameen from Econometrics, just speaking about this 10% that the PSA is asking for. It's going to be interesting to see what COSATU does, as SATU has accepted that 3%.